So we thought if we're going to have a conversation about trade and tariffs, it might make sense to offer a short primer on how and where cars are made. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. I started my career as a design engineer at Ford. I'm a little bit scared to say more than 35 years ago. And this is an industry that I find just fascinating. But let's take a step back and look at the US market to try to get a sense of how the car industry really works. So, there's about 16 million cars and light trucks sold in the United States last year, and roughly half of those vehicles were assembled in the United States, and about half of them were imported from other countries. And we can see Mexico, Canada, South Korea, Germany play an important role in that. But the story is a little bit more nuanced than this. So, for example, you can see that um, Honda opened its first so-called transplant, its first assembly plant in the United States in Marysville, Ohio in 1982. So this right-hand side of the pie includes many, many vehicles from foreign branded manufacturers. And similarly, General Motors opened their first plant in South Korea in 1962. Some of those vehicles that are being imported from South Korea are GM branded vehicles. So it's important that we understand this for context. Now, if we look toward the production side of a vehicle, a car, a light truck, it's a very complex system composed of anywhere from 15,000 to 40,000 individual parts. And the way I like to think about this is, in terms of subsystems. So when we think about human anatomy, we think about these various systems within our body that make us work. And it's quite similar for an automobile. We can think of it as being organized into these major subsystems. Now, what's important to understand about the industry structure is this kind of pyramid concept, where at the top of the pyramid, we have the vehicle manufacturers, the OEMs. And this is a fairly concentrated industry. So, four companies account for more than half the market here in the United States, and 10 companies account for almost all of the market. Now, what's important here is the punchline at the top, which is these tier one suppliers. Any company, like if Ford takes in $1 of revenue from a customer who buys an F-150, more than 50 cents of that dollar will go to pay suppliers through the tier one suppliers, which are big, sophisticated companies that actually build up full vehicle sub-assemblies. Bosch, for example, is a 50 billion euro company. A CEO of a supplier company told me years ago in the golden age of globalization that OEMs shop at the global mall. So what does that mean? It means that if you're Volkswagen, if you're Toyota, you are looking for the best suppliers. And so you have this kind of web, this matrix of these big tier ones that are supplying multiple OEMs. And then, of course, below that, you have a layer of tier two suppliers. Companies like ArcelorMittal make steel, Infineon, a German company that makes semiconductors for the car industry, Eaton, a company out of Cleveland. Some of these companies are supplying the tier ones, and some of them, of course, are supplying directly to the OEMs as well. So it's a complex structure. An OEM can easily have hundreds and hundreds of tier one suppliers. So if we look at the geography of all of this, we look across North America. This is a map produced several years ago by the Center for Automotive Research. And you can see it's a web of production facilities, assembly plants, as well as big manufacturing plants that are run typically by the vehicle manufacturers that make engines and transmissions and major components like that, as well as the tier one suppliers. And the point here is just to show that the North American market is really quite integrated, and Ontario in particular in Canada plays a very important role. Now, one of our grad students at MIT, Vishana, has done some very interesting work analyzing a database that looks at sort of who supplies whom in the global car industry. And if we look at for a number of these vehicles which are built in the United States, and we look at the supplier relationships based on the headquarters location of those suppliers, we see a far more complex picture. So it's not enough just to say a vehicle, even an American branded vehicle from, say, Ford or GM, built in the United States is necessarily made of American components. Now, some of these components may be made by foreign tier one suppliers who may have a very large production facility right here in the United States or not. It's a very, very complex and nuanced picture of how value flows through the global car industry. Automotive news typically has these kind of like who supplies whom pictures. This is for Ford's F-150 Lightning, the electric pickup truck. And you can see, like some of these suppliers are certainly foreign-based companies from Spain and France and all over the world. But they, again, might have production facilities in Mexico, in the United States, in Canada, supplying that North American value chain. And I just point out here that, and we'll get to this, one of the most important components from a value perspective in this vehicle, in any electric vehicle, is the battery, which is a joint venture between a Korean company and Ford at a plant in Georgia. This graphic was captured in the Wall Street Journal. A number of different publications have sort of painted these pictures. This particular example is from Linamar, which is a Canadian supplier, and it just shows the complexity of like how these components get built up into sub-assemblies and then built eventually into a full vehicle at the assembly plant, and how a single component on its journey to a car or truck can cross the border, a US-Canada or US-Mexico border, 3, 4, up to, in this example, 7 times on its way to ending up in the hands of a customer. So it's illustrative of the kind of complexity of the industry. It's really hard to disentangle this. One of the best academic studies, at least that I've seen, is from this fellow Alonso de Gortari, who recently, I guess about 6 years ago, published this paper on disentangling global value chains in the car industry. And I really like that framing. We ought not to think about supply chains. We ought to think about value webs in this industry, because it's not a linear chain. It's very much global, and it's an interconnected web of flow of parts and components, plus not to mention all of the sort of engineering input and labor input and everything else. So what this analysis shows is if you're looking for vehicles from Mexico, this was based on 2014 data, that are imported into the United States. If you look at sort of so-called foreign, meaning non-Mexican content, about 3/4 of that is actually US content. And so what? Well, the so what here is that maybe imposing tariffs on vehicles that are built in Mexico and imported to the United States can hurt to some extent the US industry. And we have to sort of recognize that as a reality of the complexity of this very elaborate web of value flow. Okay, so what's changing? What's kind of reshaping automotive value chains? And there's I would suggest sort of 4 major factors here. The first, which of course we'll talk about today with Jinhua, is electrification. Very, how an EV is built is different than how an internal combustion engine is built. The second is the rise of ever increasing software, intelligence, sensors, electronics in the vehicle content. The third is a kind of interesting movement toward what I would say is vertical integration, kind of going back to the future, if you will. The Rouge complex in Detroit that Henry Ford built up was a a testament to vertical integration. Rubber plants in Brazil owned by Ford. Everything was made at this Rouge complex. The glass going into the vehicle, the steel. It really was sort of like where we started from and evolved toward a less vertically integrated industry. But now, with some of the newer entrants, particularly around EVs, a movement back toward vertical integration. And then finally, shifts with factory automation. Flexible and advanced manufacturing technology will surely have an impact on the geographic footprint of automotive production. Just a quick note on EV architecture versus internal combustion engine. Fewer parts, certainly fewer moving parts in a battery electric vehicle. And importantly, and leading into our conversation, many of those parts, and particularly the battery, tend to be sourced from China, which of course this is immensely important because the battery accounts for a very substantial share of the value of an electric vehicle. And so just to double click on that, if we look at the global market for electric vehicle batteries, last year, we ended up in a situation where two companies, both based in China, CATL and BYD, account for more than half of the global market in electric vehicle batteries, and combined with the other companies from China in EV batteries, a very substantial share, more than 70% of the global market. So this is a significant in terms of implications for the future evolution of electric vehicles. And as we've talked about before in other fora, the actual upstream supply chain of the minerals and the processed materials and the value add that go into making that battery is very much controlled by Chinese entities. We're talking about the lithium, the nickel, the cobalt, and the graphite that go into making an electric vehicle battery. Again, just quickly on the topic of software and electronics, McKinsey shared some data in a report recently. The storyline here is that it's increasing. And that will affect, just as like the movement toward electrification, the increase in content in semiconductors and software and electronics will certainly have an impact on the production footprint in the global car industry. I wanted to conclude with just a quick note on, one of the really big stories, of course, about a year ago was when Mexico passed China to become number one importer to the United States. And of course, finished automobiles, as we discussed, being a very important part of that story. But this Financial Times headline sort of captures this, concern in Washington about Chinese OEMs kind of potentially using Mexico as a backdoor for bringing vehicles into the U.S. market, which I do think is a legitimate concern. Chinese OEMs have entered, are building vehicles in Mexico. BYD, lots of controversy about their proposal to build a plant in Mexico. I think it's worth just taking a quick look, though, at sort of FDI flow. So this is from the government, data from the government of Mexico, inbound foreign direct investment into Mexico from China shows a very, very distinct rise. And the automotive industry is part of this story. So I would suggest that there is something there. It is a legitimate concern to assess, to what degree Mexico could be used as an entrant for the US market. Let me just conclude with this headline that caught my attention in a sort of curious twist of irony. As someone who spent many, many years traveling back and forth to China, who has only the utmost respect for what the Chinese automotive industry has accomplished, which is no less than remarkable over the past 20 years. The way that that was built up was through joint ventures where the Chinese government said, if Volkswagen, Toyota, GM, if you want to sell in our market, you have to form a joint venture and we will learn from you. And this headline just sort of captures perhaps this ironic twist of where we are in the world today and how things have changed so profoundly. So with that, over to you, Jinhua.
Thank you so much, Zhao. So I'll continue the story by focusing on specifically US-China's comparison of the EV market. We'll start with a few numbers. In terms of the electric vehicle, including BEV and plug-in hybrid, in 2024, the US sold 1.7 million and China's 10 million. In terms of the year-on-year growth, US 10% and China is 40%. And lastly, I think probably most important is the market share of the EV in terms of the total. US 10% and China is about half. So if you look at this classic diffusion innovation, US still struggling in this area, while China has crossed the chasm here, right? So what lead to this from the consumer perspective? There's two factors to care about. One is price, one is charging. So from a price point of view, US, the EV is just more expensive, right? While in China, as of 2023, 60% of the EV are cheaper than the ICE equivalent. So consumers are making a rational choice here. Also to point out that this price comparison is after China removed the national subsidy on the electric vehicles. But of course, the local one still remains and now gradually retire as well. Also charging, right? This is a comparison I can get from last year. China has about 17 times more charger than the US. Obviously, China has 4 times population, but even per capita is 4 times. But also remember, what is important is the density per square mile, not the per person. So 17 times just makes the charging a totally different experience in China versus in US. By the way, in terms of fast charger, about a quarter in US, fast charger in China, about half of them are charged, right? Given this progress, you'll find China adopting this totally makes sense. Of course, if you look at electric vehicle, you have to look at the charging, the grade, the battery, the mineral, and then downstream the finance, safety, etc. As John pointed out, for example, China dominated the battery market. But also want to mention one thing on the public transit side. If you say in the private car, China is way better than leading US, but in buses, China entirely dominant on this, right? The overwhelming majority in China is. So here, why is this the case? I think there's a common myth that China EV is successful only because it's top-down governance, right? I try to argue that that's not the true story at all. Here, what really happened, there are a lot of different drivers from the market side, the policy, the investment, the industry, and the consumer. Let me give a few flavor of this, right? The first one is on policy. Indeed, policy plays a strong role, but I want to emphasize the word coherent. If you look at China's national policy, between the technology policy, infrastructure policy, and climate policy, with respect to electric vehicle, they really have this overall structure that brings all three together, that are pushed for the EV in a very consistent way. The second sense of the coherency is between the national government and the local government. When the national government set up the policy, the guideline, and the local government then prepare the corresponding implementation framework. So that's another important coherency that we observe in China. So that's one part of the policy side. But what's and also on policy, you look at, is this a transportation policy or environmental policy? That's the first thing people will think about electric vehicle. But more importantly, this is the industrial policy to leapfrog, and also is the energy security policy. I think that's really the fundamental motivation for China to really push for this. All right. The second one, I want to say something about the industry here, right? I would say the innovation we see in China is just refreshing, right? On the battery swap, on the comfort entertainment, on the cost effectiveness, but also this innovation penetrates every corner of the market here, from the price range to electric range. Every part you see some company in China producing certain vehicles. This is a comparison like this mainstream model between BYD Seal and Tesla Model 3. In most of the performance metrics, they're really comparable. And the price, of course, is much, much cheaper in China. But more than this diversity, this innovation, there's also this sheer degree of competition here, right? There are three groups. There's the EV manufacturers, then there's a smart vehicle system, and then those in betweens, right? Here, for example, we talk about software-defined vehicle a lot. But for China, if you ask Xiaomi make phones. Why we make phones? For them, software-defined is built in their DNA. Of course, that's the case, right? That's where they start from, right? Another way to put it, in China, imagine US, where you have 20 Tesla-like companies competing with each other. That's what China looks like today here. Last one to mention a little bit about consumer preference. This is a survey done last year, compare US, Europe, and the Chinese in terms of what do they look when they buy a car. You'll find Europe and US like very similar, the price, the cost, the performance, etc. But look at Chinese. They pay attention to technology-enabled safety, to cutting-edge technology in vehicles, to maturity of driver assistance systems. So Chinese customers really are representing the future here. They pay much more attention to the technology. So all these things combine to really support this success. Last, I want to say, EV growth in China is not a surprise. If you look at the past 30, 40 years, China started with building toys, shirts, furniture, then moved into TVs, cell phones, computers. And then today, high-speed rails, architecture designs, gene testing, whatever level, once China masters technology, they scale up very, very quickly. So this growth is really part of the norm in terms of China's industrial development. So one thing I do want to say one thing about tariff. Tariff per se is not necessarily good or bad, right? China used it, South Korea used it, Japan used it, depending really how to use the tariff in a meaningful way here. But what's the worst is this high ego and a high tariff combination that the US has here, right? Let me give you, ask a question, that when is a tariff useful? I would say the following. If the tariff facilitates learning, the tariff would be useful. For example, for a long time, China was set with the tariff. The tariff is roughly the technology differential between the domestic market and the foreign market, so that you keep enough pressure upon the local industries. They can be protected to some degree, they can survive, but have the pressure to keep innovating on this. Right? All right, so pass forward. You're building walls or laying red carpet. This is my own personal opinion. I would say US should do what China did 30 years ago, which is to invite the best EV companies in, set up joint ventures, and I also important set it now when the US OEM still have something to offer, right? So it's a meaningful partnership, right? And this is our idea for market for technology. So I will pause here. I will have some remarks on China as a whole, but we'll come back to during our conversations. Now I'll give the forum to Jack.
Yeah, thank you, Jinhua, and thanks to you and John for those great presentations. I thought, well, I'll start off talking about tariffs. I was just at the New York Auto Show, which is going on right now, and I had a chance to talk to quite a few auto executives and get a feeling for how they're reacting to the tariffs. And I think you can sum it up by just that it's really bad for the auto industry, and everybody is struggling to figure out how they're going to deal with this totally new situation, which they didn't really see coming. I think as John's presentation pointed out, you have these extremely complex supply chains. These have built up over decades, and they were based on assumptions, on treaties that the automakers thought that they could rely on. The USMCA, which allows free trade between Mexico and Canada, and it's a big reason why you have so many parts suppliers in Canada and Mexico. That was actually negotiated by the first Trump administration and now that same administration is violating it. And I kept asking these auto executives, how are you going to deal with this? And basically the answer was, we have no idea. They're all trying to game out what's going to be the competitive situation. How much of this cost can we absorb? How much do we have to pass on to our customers? Can we even survive this? What products are we going to have to stop selling? Which ones can we emphasize? I think generally speaking, they're going to be gravitating towards the more expensive products that have a higher profit margin. It's going to be harder to find a affordable economy car. And the winners and losers are not going to be all that predictable. I think, as John pointed out, that some of the most American-made cars are actually foreign brands. The Honda Passport, made in, I believe, Indiana, has one of the highest percentages of American-made parts of any car. So that vehicle may become more competitive, and something like the GM Trax, which is imported from Korea, a very affordable SUV, that will become unaffordable. But I think no one really knows where this is going. And I think that the biggest thing that I heard over and over from the executives was just the uncertainty. How can you possibly plan when policy is changing on almost a daily basis? The structure of the tariffs is still very unclear. It seems to depend on the whim of the president. And it's totally out of sync with the way that the auto industry operates, which is very long time frames. I mean, the cars that we're going to be seeing on the lots in 4 or 5 years are already being developed at the car makers. I was speaking to the head of Volkswagen of America. Volkswagen builds a lot of cars in Mexico, in Puebla. And he said they just installed a new paint shop in Puebla, which is a big investment. Paint shops are very expensive. And they replaced a paint shop that had been there since the 60s. So they're making investment decisions with a decades-long time frame, and trying to reconcile that with basically a daily, almost hourly news flow. And it's pretty much an impossible situation. So then let me focus a little on how that affects EVs, because that's something that I'm very interested in. Is this good or bad for electric vehicles? And I think I don't really know the answer to that question, and none of the auto executives I talked to could really give me an answer. They're still trying to figure it out. But I think there's a couple of things you can say. I mean, first of all, tariffs are going to be bad for electric vehicles for the same reasons they're bad for any vehicle, just because of the disruption to the supply chain. There may be some upside in the sense that I think, as John pointed out, Tesla is among the most American-made of all the cars, very vertically integrated. They do get quite a few parts from Mexico, but all the Teslas that are sold in the United States are made in either California or Texas. So conceivably, that gives Tesla something of a price advantage, depending on how these tariffs work out. The Volkswagen ID.4 is another example. I asked the Volkswagen people about this a couple of days ago. That has a battery made in America. It's assembled in the United States. Does have some foreign parts, but that might be a vehicle where the price differential between that and an ICE vehicle, an internal combustion engine vehicle, actually narrows, which might be good for EV adoption. But I think on balance, probably it's going to be bad for a number of other reasons. Semiconductor tariffs. EVs have more semiconductors than ICE vehicles, so that's going to be an extra cost. There's tariffs on rare earths, which are essential for electric vehicle motors. That China is basically banning exports of rare earths. I'm told that automakers have stockpiles that will last maybe 6 months or so, but then they're going to have a problem. And then you just have a Republican policy right now that is very hostile to electric vehicles. I mean, the Biden administration actually attempted something kind of similar to what Jinhua was describing in China, trying to promote electric vehicles, establish a supply chain, and explicitly because the United States did not want to be dependent on China. And the Republicans have said they're going to dismantle all of that, get rid of the buyer tax credits. There's tax credits that you get for, or subsidies that you get for building batteries in the United States, for developing minerals. There were subsidies for electric vehicle chargers, which, as Jinhua pointed out, is still a problem in the US. And Republicans say they're going to make that all go away. We'll see what happens, because a lot of this investment in new EV factories and battery factories has actually gone to Republican congressional districts. So there may actually be some resistance within the Republican Party to dismantling all of that policy. But again, that's another headwind. So all in all, I'd say that the outlook for EVs, because of the tariffs, is not that great. I mean, generally speaking, bracketing out the tariffs, the EV market in the US actually has been doing okay. The most recent figures I saw from Cox Automotive were plus 11% EV sales quarter on quarter for the first quarter. And you have to keep in mind that ICE sales have been flat or declining. Ford actually had a decline in gasoline powered car sales in the last quarter, and a big increase in EV sales. GM doubled its EV sales. So it's actually a growth market for the automakers. The problem they have is they're not really making money on EVs yet, because they haven't gotten up to scale. So all these headwinds are going to delay the time when they can reach that level. But I think the larger point is that even though you're seeing GM and Ford and Hyundai and a lot of our Honda and Toyota are going to start selling EVs pretty soon in large numbers, even though that's happening, the companies with the scale are in China: BYD, Geely, Chery. If you look at the top 10 EV makers in the world, there's only one that's a US company, which is Tesla. GM and Ford are not in the top 10 or even close. So that's just a huge disadvantage going forward, because the more scale you have, the more you can drive down your costs. That's why I think I saw someone asking the question, why are EVs cheaper in China? And I think the answer is just scale. They're making them at such big numbers that they can drive down the cost. And we're not at that point in the United States yet. And that's just a virtuous circle for the Chinese companies, and but a recipe for decline for the US companies. So that's not a very positive outlook for the US companies. I also wanted to just talk a little bit about Mexico, which I think John mentioned. I was there, I think in October, visited some BYD dealers, and I mean, they're doing really well. They're opening up dealerships at an incredible rate. I visited one dealership. They were still actually building the dealership, that they were putting the cinder blocks up. It was a vacant lot, but they were already selling cars basically from a shack. And people were buying them. They were coming in like crazy. They have this little economy car. I think it's called the Seagull, and costs around $20,000. Perfect urban mobility type of vehicle, even in a country like Mexico, which doesn't have much infrastructure. And to John's point, I think that the Chinese strategy long term is to try to kind of bracket the United States with these products, knowing that at some point American consumers are going to say, why can't I buy this car in the United States? And the BYD dealers were all telling me, I'll be happy to sell Americans cars. You just come down here, and I'll be happy to give them one. I think you'd probably have trouble getting it across the border. But I do think that long term, that trying to keep the Chinese out is not going to be successful. It's just going to make the U.S. automakers less competitive. And I agree with Jinhua. I think the end game is that you have to let the Chinese car makers set up factories here, sell cars here, the same as what happened with the Japanese car makers back in the 60s and 70s. And they're now, I think Toyota, I think it makes almost as many cars as GM. I think they're number 2 after GM in the number of cars that they manufacture in the United States. And it's just the last point I wanted to make, still leaving some time for questions, is just Tesla, because I think Jinhua had a slide talking about how you have 20 Teslas in China creates this incredible competitive pressure and really drives innovation. the Chinese car makers are incredibly innovative. I've seen one car that could actually turn on 360 degrees because the wheels go in different directions. They're just doing amazing things. And Tesla had played that role in the United States. I'm not even sure we would be talking about electric cars now if it hadn't been for Elon Musk and Tesla 10 years ago. Tesla was the company that really proved that electric cars could be stylish and practical and fun. And, I remember I've covered the auto industry for quite a while, and I remember there was a time around, 2019, 2020, when it sort of started to dawn on the incumbent car makers, GM, Ford, Mercedes, BMW, that Tesla was a real threat. It was taking market share. And that really lit a fire under them and made them start investing in EVs to get on that learning curve and figure out how to make good products. And they're starting to come out with some pretty good products. But the thing is that recently, Tesla just doesn't seem to be playing that role anymore. Tesla sales actually peaked in 2023 and have been declining since then. They were down by double digits in the last quarter. And Elon Musk, who has always been the driving force, just doesn't seem to be that interested in making cars anymore. Tesla decided about a year ago not to make a low cost, it was sort of, people were calling it the Model 2. I don't think it had an official name, but it would have been a $25,000 EV made in Monterrey, Mexico. Elon Musk decided a year ago not to build that car. They're still supposed to be coming out with a less expensive car by June, but we haven't even seen a prototype, so no idea what that's going to look like. I don't think it's going to be a completely new vehicle. And so my point is that you just don't have Tesla pushing the rest of the industry the way it did. And that's, I think, taking away impetus. And when Tesla sales are falling, that also slows down EV adoption, because Tesla still accounts for around 45% of all the EVs sold in the United States. So all in all, I guess that's kind of a bleak picture of where things are going. Just one little anecdote I wanted to tell. I was on a radio call-in show a couple of weeks ago, and a lady called in and said, with all these tariffs, no one's going to buy new cars, and pretty soon they're just going to keep fixing their old cars, and pretty soon we're going to be like Cuba, where people are just driving around these 20-year-old cars, which is kind of an exaggeration, but in a way that the point makes a lot of sense, that all these things together, policy, tariffs, really could set back the U.S. auto industry for quite a long time. So I'll stop there, and thanks very much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. John, do you offer some reflections?
I would, yeah. I mean, two quick thoughts. Number one, the concept of moving production facilities. Can production facilities, assembly plants, manufacturing plants be moved? Yes, they can. Does it take a lot of time and energy and effort and dislocation? Yes, it does. If we go back to 1963, when the US got into a spat with Europe over poultry imports, we imposed something that's known as the chicken tax in the industry. This is going back to the 60s. That basically imposed a 25% tariff on pickup trucks being imported into the United States, which remains in place today. And it's not by coincidence that the pickup truck market in the US is, I'd say, very much dominated by the domestic manufacturers. So can tariffs sort of structure the shape of the industry? Yes, they can. Can they reshape the industry? Yes, they can, but at great cost and expense. And that gets me to my second point, which is the question of why. If we ask about China, there might be a legitimate why that we can address. If we ask, why are we imposing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, our neighbors, our allies, our friends, I throw up my hands because I don't have an answer to that. I think that when we created, first something called the APTA, which was 1965, the US started collaborating with Canada and basically formed one automotive market. It just made sense. It was win-win. It was win for Canada. It was win for the United States. It made sense. And it's, I think, tremendously benefited both companies, both countries. And when that was expanded to NAFTA in 1994, and then, as Jack mentioned, to the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, it feels to me like we all benefit from having a more integrated trade bloc within North America. That is my opinion. It's hard to come by sort of data on this, but I would encourage all of us to ask the why. What is the motivation in the policy? What do we hope that the policy will ultimately accomplish?
Thank you, John. Before I invite move for the Q&A from the audience, I do want to add two remarks about China, about Chinese society, a particular layperson Chinese mentality here, right? With respect to the tariff here, right? So this is beyond the electric vehicle or auto industry's general remark. The first thing is if China-US really want to fight a sustained trade war, right? Hope that's not the case. It seems unlikely to be the case. But if it does, right, and both sides will suffer, but the tolerance of pain in China is much weaker than 20 years ago in China, but still way higher than what an American can endure. Right? The level of suffering at the layperson level, the family level, is different order of magnitude here. Right? I don't think in that aspect, US can sustain this long-term suffering there. The second point is, again, in the layperson level, not just the leader at the technology, just average Chinese. There's this notion of loss for modernity, right? This has been there for 40 years almost, right? The notion of open to technology, the notion of I'm willing to try, right? If something come on, let's try it before I make a judgment. Chinese are much less nostalgic to what happened in the 1960s, 1950s. In the modern Chinese, like my generation born in the 70s, throughout our life, things are getting better. Technology, whenever introduced, has been a positive thing. The general notion of the future is better. Technology brings a positive change. It's very much embedded in the Chinese psyche here. Right? So that really have a lot of consequence on the electrification, automation. Today we'll talk about AI. For example, AI into innovation, US and China are really battling each other. And in terms of deployment in the industry, also competing very much. But in terms of, say, 75 years old grandma, in China, I just visited 1 month ago. Whoever you are, young or old, everybody is playing with DeepSeek. Every single corner, the poor, the rich, everybody playing with it, right? The penetration of this technology into the average family in China is much, much faster, right? So that's the 2 point I make. The last thing maybe is more of a call for action. I also see an important asymmetry in terms of the understanding of each other. Specifically, the Chinese understanding of America, again, in general, is much higher than America's understanding of China, right? For that, after COVID, I see a dangerous plummeting of American people visiting China for whatever reason, tourism, business. There's still, for example, 270,000 Chinese students in American studying, learning about US society, understanding the culture, understand the norm. We have together maybe a couple thousand of American students in China doing the counterpart this, right? That's dangerous for whatever reason. In the minimum, to bring this more understanding of each other and visit each other, that's what I hope that we can do in regard to the situation. Thank you. That will stop here. I give it to move for questions.
Yeah. Thanks all. That was a fascinating discussion and a lot of questions in the chat. So I'll touch upon, maybe start with one on, tooling time and, time to set up a new plant. So Stephen Zoff asked, what's the typical lead time required today to stand up an assembly plant in the US? When is the last time, one was actually built? And is the pace of design and tooling much faster in China than in more traditional, markets? And, is it much easier to develop a new car development time from your traditional, 5-year cycles? Is it like down to 2 years in China? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, John, go ahead.
I would just, Stephen, it's a great question. I would offer, I don't have hard data on that handy, but all of the evidence that I've seen that point to the fact that, the question was asked, why is China sort of making these electric vehicles so much cheaper? And Jinhua and others have mentioned scale. But I would say speed is a really big part of the formula as well. And it does appear that there's evidence that things just move faster in China. And Stephen, as you well know, we live in a country with extensive permitting requirements, with a democratic process where people can very easily say, I don't want that factory in my backyard, and so on and so forth. And I think in China, we don't have many of those same constraints, or at least not as profoundly. And so that does lead to sort of faster time to set up plants and so forth in China. Jinhua?
Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I can address part of that. Well, I mean, first of all, just on speed of development, I mean, I've heard from car makers that they're sort of the Western car makers that are kind of astonished about how quickly the Chinese move, that they're developing new cars in 2 years or less, which is half as long as it takes in the United States under the best of circumstances, or in Europe. In terms of moving factories, I mean, there's been a lot of talk that the unions have been saying, well, GM just needs to reopen factories that's closed in Lordstown and places like that. But even if you have the building, just getting the machinery, setting up the assembly line, that you're talking, minimum, absolute best case would be over a year, but really 2 years is more realistic, or longer, plus a huge expense. You're really talking hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, which nobody is going to spend when policy is as fluid as it is right now.
The only thing we'll add is the different mental model. Like for Huawei, for Xiaomi, they make phones, right? They think phones should be updated every half a year. They are using the exact same mental model to build cars. The second thing, with the over-the-air update, we're really changing what is the new model here, right? They send you a package every 2 weeks to update your car. Back to you.
And unfortunately, just one other thing is Apple was looking at making cars and they didn't, which was maybe too bad. We could have used that.
Jane Chu had a question on the oil and gas industry, and that the oil and gas industry is a major reason why ICE vehicles are so entrenched in the US economy. How prevalent is the oil and gas lobby in China? And what is China doing to quell the pro-oil and gas sentiment? And what can US learn from China in terms of EV messaging and marketing strategy?
Yeah, on that, I think the difference is less of a policy difference, is the resource reality difference, right? China does not have much oil. They are imports on this, right? China has a lot of coal. So I mentioned which type of policy should we look at it? The last one, I think the very visceral one, is the energy security policy, right? For China to switch away from cars. So therefore, it's a very different condition for China to incorporate that. So less of a proactive policy difference there.
So, we've been seeing the tariffs, but, a couple of senators have introduced bills on banning Chinese vehicles because of, Chinese-made connected car parts, which can, transmit data. And this is a national security concern. You have cars with, these high-definition cameras, which are, recording everything. So, and obviously a ban on this is more extreme than tariffs. So any comments on this and how one can tackle it?
For that, again, personal view on this, right? I think those are all excuses. And also, if you want to find excuses, there are better excuses to find. There are more legitimate reasons to find. To say this is the connected part, therefore we can ban it. For example, if you really done that, find a third-party auditor, audit it, provide objective evidence, then you can talk about it, right? Using this as a reason is just a very weak reason.
All right, so assuming we don't have tariffs, don't have ban, and we get Chinese EVs into the US, so given the lower production costs, vertically integrated supply chains, and the rapid technology advancements, if these EVs enter the US markets, can American automakers realistically compete on price and quality with the Chinese EVs?
No. mean, it's a slight exaggeration, but I mean, I think if the Chinese came in right now, the U.S. automakers would basically be doomed. They can't compete on EVs for price. The point of tariffs, the Biden tariffs, was to give them some time to become competitive and at least have a fighting chance. But as I mentioned, the Trump administration seems determined to dismantle all of that.
But I would suggest that they could learn from the Chinese. I don't rule that out. I think that, the Japanese automotive industry in the late 1970s and early 1980s was the best thing ever to happen to Detroit. It woke them from their slumber. Uh, at MIT, we published a very important study called The Machine That Changed the World that explored why is there that advantage in terms of quality, production speed, and so forth. And, sort of helped to share the Toyota production system with the world, this concept of lean production. I do think that there's room for learning. And if we had the attitude that we could embrace that, and find those business structures that we think would enable and safeguard intellectual property to flow from the Chinese to the Americans, I would embrace that. I'm
Yeah,
not saying it's easy, but I think that it is doable.
right. I think that's the key point. As I mentioned, when tariff is useful, I'll argue if it does facilitate learning, tariff is a good tool here, right? And China, I'm so experienced at this in the 90s. We should just literally learn that, right? And also when I say the set up the JV setting now, because at this stage, US OEM still have a lot to offer to the Chinese counterpart there. The OEM in US understand the local market much better, understand US preference, understand how to deal with the labor union, local regulation. All these know-hows Chinese EV do not have. So if at this stage you set up a JV, you still have a good negotiating power here, right? If you to 5 years, 10 years from now, when the technology is so behind, then you're even losing that opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Jinhua.
Just one more thought on this, Bhuvan, which is, there's also another path forward, which is, to innovate out, right? I mean, part of why China went into EVs for many reasons. Jinhua mentioned energy security as a huge driver, air pollution. I can tell you it was not climate change that motivated China to become a leader in electric vehicles. But part of it was the story that I think the Chinese realized that we're not going to win the internal combustion engine game. It's a very complicated machine to build. And so with Minister Wang Gang, they said, let's double down on this nascent technology, this electrification. The United States could choose to do something like that, to say, what is the alternative that may even be far beyond what our current concept of a privately owned automobile is, and create a national program to say, we're going to really push hard to, to push this technology forward. It's another path forward.
So, I mean, that's a great segue to my next question that Caleb asked. Collectively, are these strong enough signals to strategically shift the USA to a greater share of transit, train, and other mobility investments? And if not this, then what would be the signal?
It's interesting. Robin Chase last week we were talking about this, right? For example, in this forum we discussing a lot on the sustainable transportation, promoting public transit, walking, cycling. Today, because we're focused on the car industry, we didn't talk about that part, right? But last week, Robin, we discussed it's almost ironic if it takes to sabotage the car industry to achieve sustainable mobility goal. That's going to be not the best way forward on this, right? But in terms of if China, US can work together, what are the potential benefit? I think potential will make smaller cars as a possibility. China very good at making cheaper and smaller cars, right? Jointly, we potentially can make safer cars. That's also possible. And clearly, we can make cleaner cars, right? Those are the positive side of this, right?
Yeah, we have 1 minute left, so maybe the last question. I think some people were interested in, will the tariffs have a greater effect on EVs or ICEs? And EVs, I mean, some people were saying maybe EVs have lesser parts, so it's lesser tariffs. But then the battery is mostly, coming from China, but so then that has higher value. So Jack, I'm wondering if, at the NYT, y'all have done any analysis on this?
Yeah, well, I've been trying to analyze it, and I was asking people about it this week. I don't think anyone knows the answer yet. I mean, those are all valid points. It's true that EVs have fewer parts, so in theory, it's easier to adjust the supply chain. There's the battery industry within the United States is growing very quickly. LG has 3 factories operating in the US already and has several more that are going to be coming online in the next few years to bring the total to 7. And they're not the only company. So there is a domestic supply chain that's emerging and that would theoretically be immune from tariffs. That's the positive side. I think the risk is that the US car makers, except for Tesla, are not making money from EVs. And if they're under financial stress, which they will be, they may make the decision to focus on gasoline cars because that's where they make the most money. And I think that's probably the biggest risk. I can't tell you now how it's going to sort out.
Great. It's 1 o'clock. Sorry to cut off the discussion here. Last, I would just say this is a rapidly evolving situation. Jack, Zhao, we try to offer some initial observation. Maybe half year later, we should come back to the forum to see what really happened in the next 6 months. Everyone, please join me. Thank Jack and Zhao and Buwa for the presentation and conversation today. Thank you, everybody.